Popular culture is a defining feature of our daily lives. It's the television we watch.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The music we listen to, the films we see, and the games we play.
Women who were outraged when they saw the type of entertainment that many boys are entertaining themselves with.
This saturation can easily turn into obsession, distrust, and even fear.
The factor here is popular entertainment. You know, if a car breaks down in most mainstream movies, it's not because the car hasn't been serviced regularly, it's sabotage. So I think the conditioning of perception that a lot of popular culture brings to us allows us in certain ways to be predisposed to conspiratorial forms of thinking.
As we gravitate to dramatic, larger-than-life stories, myths as outlandish as the entertainment we consume begin to spread.
How could people say these things when they weren't there? And I was.
These are the great myths in entertainment history. On an otherwise ordinary Sunday night in 1938, a radio broadcast aired.
We take you now to Grover's Mill, New Jersey.
Intended as a light-hearted scare on the night before Halloween, it became so much more. At the center of the furore was Orson Welles, a 23-year-old up-and-coming star of stage and radio. He had devised a radio play that would sound like a real news report, intermittently interrupting a fictional Sunday night music broadcast. Each news break would further the fictional story of a horrifying Martian invasion, a story based on the famous science fiction novel, The War of the Worlds. It began with an announcement that set the broadcast up as a work of fiction.
The Columbia Broadcasting System and its affiliated stations present Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater on the air in The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells.
But for some listeners, tuning in casually on a Sunday night, they may have missed this important context.
Many of them happen to come into this, what sounds like any other dance band, playing rather relaxing, languorous music that's the perfect accompaniment to whatever you might be doing on a Sunday night. A significant portion of the audience starts tuning in late, and then they start hearing these strange interruptions.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt our program of dance music to bring you a special bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News.
For a lot of people who tuned in at that point, maybe they got as far as, you know, the scene at the Martian landing site where the cylinder opens and the heat ray kills everybody.
Strike them head on. Lord, they're turning into flames. Now the whole field's caught up by the woods, the barns, the gas tanks for the automobiles, spreading everywhere. It's coming this way now.
Then gradually, as the show progresses, the news reports break in more and more and start talking about this landing of Martians on planet Earth.
At least 40 people, including 6 state troopers, lie dead in a field east of the village of Grover's Mill.
After the broadcast, reports began to emerge that people were believing what they were hearing, that there was panic in the streets across America. In a small town in New Jersey where the story was set, residents were said to have grabbed their guns and made their way to the supposed landing site. An eerie fog had descended that night, making visibility low. There were stories that people shot at what they thought was the towering figure of the Martian invaders. The next day, they discovered they had been shooting holes in the town's water tower. People were calling the police, asking where they can get gas masks and where they could fight the invaders. In Indianapolis, a woman burst into a church service exclaiming that it was the end of the world. In St. Louis, Missouri, residents in some areas were gathering in the streets to plan a counteroffensive. Similar stories were echoed across the country. But what actually happened that night? Was there widespread panic in the streets? Or were these reports grossly exaggerated? The truth lies somewhere in between.
When people around the country started to believe or suspect that this might be a real event, an interesting phenomenon happened, which is that, if this were to happen today, I think the first impulse a lot of us would have would be to go on our phones, to, go to social media or a news website, try to get some piece of evidence to verify or contradict what we were hearing. Obviously, in the 1930s, people didn't have that instant access to the news media. What they could do was they could pick up a phone and call some sort of authority figure.
The police started getting phone calls from people who were panicking, saying, "What's going on? Is this real?" And the police would say, "I don't know," which scares people even more because, I don't know, right? So you can see how there would be this general socialized panic.
Others called the nearest newspaper outlets. Switchboards lit up with calls from confused listeners trying to verify what they were hearing. Suddenly, on a usually quiet Sunday night, switchboard operators were overwhelmed. By October 1938, war was already brewing in Europe. And in America, tensions were high. Some believed what they were hearing was news of a German invasion.
So the newspapers are at the center of whatever hysteria is happening. They're getting the full force of it in a way that I think gave them a mistaken impression of how widespread this event was.
With little time to verify the substance of these calls, newspaper journalists started pulling together the anecdotes they were hearing into the next day's front-page news.
Newspapers take the leap of then saying this represents, as one of them called it, a tidal wave of terror sweeping across the country, that tens of thousands or millions or who knows how many people were swept up in this, when really it was a small, localized phenomenon. It was real, but it didn't affect nearly as many people as you would have thought if you had seen the headlines the next day.
Cautiously, I came out of the tunnel and made my way up Canal Street. Reached 14th Street, and there again were black powder and several bodies and an evil, ominous smell from the gratings of the cellars of some of the houses. I wandered up through the 30s and 40s.
With only limited information, the reaction from police and the media to the unfolding situation was swift.
As Wells is doing the final sort of monologues describing professors wandering through the East Coast of the United States, and he's looking through the window of the control room into the main room there, he can see more and more blue uniformed police officers.
Were you aware of terror at the time you were giving this role? Were you aware that terror was going on throughout the nation?
Oh, no, of course not. We did Dracula, and it seemed to me during Dracula I had high hopes that people would react as they do in a movie.
Although the police appearance at the radio station on the night of the recording was brief, in the days that followed, all eyes were on Orson Welles to account for the mass panic he had caused.
It came rather as a great surprise to us that a story, fine H.G. Wells' classic fantasy, the original for so many succeeding comic strips and adventure stories and novels, about a mythical invasion by monsters from the planet Mars should have had so profound an effect upon radio listeners.
Despite the fact that there was a huge disconnect between the panic newspapers were reporting and the localized realities, over time, the story of panic in the streets has only grown in the retelling. Its lasting impact is felt far more in the story's place in popular folklore and the ever-growing myth of panic that grew around that fateful night in 1938.
Whether all those people who jammed the highways and even took to the hills to escape the Martians have forgiven me, it's another matter.
The War of the Worlds panic is one example of a story evolving more and more over time. The grain of truth polished and embellished the further we get away from the actual events of the day. We can cast back even further to find more tales of audience panic. The year was 1896. Cinema was a new medium being toured around to fascinated audiences. And the Lumière brothers were at the forefront of this revolution.
They invented the cinématographie. And the reason why that's important in history is because that was the first projector that successfully projected a film in a public setting.
One of many short films they made was a 50-second-long shot of a train arriving at a station. As the tale goes, when the Lumières screened the film in Paris, the audience was so sure the train barreling toward the camera on screen was going to crash into them that it caused a panic. Audience members leapt from their chairs and ran for the back of the theater. Stories of the panic spread through newspapers reporting on the showing of the Lumière brothers' film. But did this illusion cause the mass hysteria reported and retold for 100 years?
It is definitely one of the most persistent myths in film history.
But was this new form of illusion as entertainment as fearful to audiences as stories would have us believe?
The reason why people think it happened is probably because people assumed it must have happened. People had never seen anything like this before. How could they not think it was real? So people kind of buy into this assumption of how people would first respond to a technology they don't know about.
In the intervening years, the myth of panic at the screening has lived on, and it has been described as cinema's founding myth.
There's just no real evidence that it actually led to a panic or anything like that. One reason why I don't find that story believable is the very nature of the shot itself. You're clearly on a train platform at an angle. The train is not coming directly to the people who are viewing the film. It's going at an angle. You can see people on the train platform. If they're not scared, why would people in the audience somehow think it was a real train coming at them? So there's a lot of reasons to doubt whether that particular story is true.
But perhaps the myth was a cleverly concocted marketing tool.
I don't know if this is true, but I always speculate that the Lumière brothers promoted that story. They didn't really become permanent filmmakers, but they thought if they promoted this way, this would be something that would get people to come to see this amazing new technology.
True or not, the myth speaks to the incredible power cinema has to reproduce reality. Perhaps it is how relatable this experience is that makes the myth so persistent.
I think the reason why this myth has persisted so much is it deals with something very fundamental about what cinema is, or basically any moving image technology, television or smartphones. We know that there's this sort of magical power. We know that the things on the screen are not actually there, yet when we're watching, it's like we just surrender and pretend they're actually there.
A power any member of a cinema audience has experienced firsthand. While many of us have been entertained and delighted for years by the seductive escapism of film and other popular media, these forms of entertainment have often also found themselves in the firing line.
To the media and the entertainment industries, we need your wholehearted participation in this cause.
Over the course of the 20th century, recurring myths and misconceptions have swirled around whatever happened to be popular with the youth of the day, usually referred to as a moral panic.
So a moral panic happens when a large group of people become very concerned about something that seems to have ethical implications. So it tends to be a social phenomenon rather than an individual phenomenon.
Having reached such a point in public acceptance, it is no wonder the comics have become a strong social force, an influence on our behavior pattern that is bizarre, to say the least.
In the 1950s and 60s, the moral panic played out with comic books. Blamed for an increase in juvenile delinquency, and linked to same-sex relationships, fascism, and the corruption of youth.
The media panic that occurred in the 1950s and 1960s was very much about cultural values. Folks were really starting to explore things artistically that maybe they wouldn't have before. So you saw in comic books, authors and artists starting to explore horror and crime themes.
Comic books were selling, tens of millions of copies a week, mostly to kids, but also to adults. Some person suggested that the comic books were leading to an increase in juvenile delinquency. The U.S. Senate got involved, and they thought, oh, this seems bad.
With the comic book industry facing the scrutiny of the U.S. Senate, they established a Comics Code Authority in 1954 to police the content of every comic book that hit the shelves. Versions of the Comics Code and the seal of approval for sale remained in place until as recently as 2011. Though comic books and cartoons have continued to push the envelope. As the social landscape changed, so too did the interests of young people. The 1980s saw a rise in materialism and consumerism. Popular culture overturned conventional and religious norms. The 1980s also saw an increase in the popularity of the tabletop role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons. Feared by good Christians around the world who believed the game was the same as Satanism and opened children up to demonic possession.
Well, the satanic panic was a larger phenomenon. Crimes were being blamed on the occult, and then the game Dungeons & Dragons, which many people played in the 80s and 90s and continue to play, has some themes and characters that people viewed as representative of the occult. People who didn't really know the particulars of it were afraid it was yet another way that the occult was infiltrating our lives.
D&D continued to rise in popularity until something, essentially better came along.
Which in the late 1990s saw Harry Potter mania as a platform for the rise in the interest in witchcraft. In the 90s, video games' 3D graphics also took a great leap forward, creating entire online worlds through better images and soundscapes. And so video games became the next target of moral panics.
People viewed there to be a correlation between violence and video games, and I think this is just an extension of what happened with comic books.
Women are portrayed as sexual objects or women being bludgeoned to death.
Video games were things that no one had ever seen before, and they didn't know exactly how they would impact young people's minds, and so they got blamed for all sorts of violence. In particular, the Columbine shooting, infamously in 1999, was blamed on violent video games, at least in part.
Members of the entertainment industry must also do their part. They and the rest of us cannot kid ourselves. Our children are being fed a dependable daily dose of violence.
I want to add to this that often this is done to score political points.
The campaign to scapegoat violent video games became so intense, it led to a congressional hearing and an investigation initiated by President Clinton. While many of the issues surrounding moral panics are real, the majority of today's youth are simply enjoying the latest book or trend of the day. Yet each new moral panic is often spearheaded and exaggerated by a subset of the population who want to decree right from wrong.
We have a number of stoner gangs throughout Southern California that are becoming more active than they have been in the past.
The people that fuel the moral panics tend to be socially conservative people. They tend to be in power, right? They are the ones who have the power to label groups as deviant. Those groups being gays and lesbians, or immigrants, or kids who like heavy metal music, or take your pick.
The continuing emergence of these moral panics reveals a generational divide between parents or policymakers and the interests of a society's youth. A divide that continues to trigger panic at the meaning and influence of popular pastimes they just don't understand. Celebrities have always been an object of public fascination and popular culture. And sometimes, the fame they experience in life evolves into myths greater and more powerful in death. Perhaps the most notorious among these myths is the death and subsequent afterlife of Elvis Presley. When Elvis died of heart failure on the 16th of August 1977, aged only 42 years old, it shocked the world. In the days after his death, some devastated fans turned to the possibility that he was, in fact, still alive.
It shook the time when he died. So it very much is a perfect kind of environment for these conspiracies to breed. It's a significant world issue that is impacting people. It's making people feel upset, feel stressed. So they're searching out explanations.
In the intervening years, theories and sightings have run rampant, each wilder than the last.
There's been society set up around spotting Elvis out there and arguing where you've seen him and whatnot. So it meets the key ingredients of a conspiracy, and that's why it kind of maintains interest still now.
Elvis spotting has kept the myth alive for nearly 50 years. He was seen on the day of his death at Memphis Airport, buying a one-way ticket to Buenos Aires. He was at a local supermarket in Michigan in 1988, or at the local Burger King. He was pumping gas or caught on video working on the grounds of his home, Graceland. He was an extra in an airport scene in the 1990s movie Home Alone.
One of the more implausible stories is that Elvis faked his own death in order to go undercover for the FBI and investigate the mafia. You know, which is hilarious, right? You imagine the FBI sitting around thinking, who can we get to go undercover? And someone says, the most recognized person on the planet. We'll get that guy. It just doesn't ring true.
I don't think any of the stories about what happened to Elvis ultimately are plausible, but I think these are all explainable by the beliefs and values that we have and the things that we want to be true, not by any real evidence that we have to believe that they're true.
The death of such an iconic figure is such a profound shock. Fans simply can't believe the truth. And while myths of dead celebrities living on in hiding continue to emerge, so too does the reverse. Musician Paul McCartney has been the subject of theories suggesting that he has died and been replaced by a look-alike actor. It began in Detroit in 1969. A radio DJ got a tip from a mystery caller who told him to play parts of the Beatles' White Album backwards, revealing hidden speech that fans believe pointed to the fact that Paul was dead.
You know, I haven't been too well on the tour. I just felt a bit ill, that's all. And I was sick.
This one strikes me as almost inevitable, right? The Beatles fans were so obsessive. They were looking for hidden meanings and clues in everything, right? So you get a couple of clues that, you know, Paul might be dead. Somebody suggested it on a radio program and it spread like wildfire.
The theory goes that Paul McCartney died in a car crash in 1966 and was replaced by someone else who supposedly went on to pretend to be Paul for years.
We're going to just do a few songs from our new album, so get your phones out.
From this first seed grew a deep fascination among some fans who reportedly pored over Beatles albums looking for further clues.
And then they went to town over the Abbey Road album cover, which the Beatles put together well after the Paul's Dead conspiracy theory became popular. They're crossing Abbey Road. It looks like a funeral procession. There's this Volkswagen, and the license plate is LMW 28IF. So LMW is Linda McCartney Weeps, and 28 IF is 28 if, suggesting Paul would have been 28 if he was alive when the album came out, except for he would have been 27, right? So this is how conspiracy theories tend to go. You can make a clue out of anything.
In contrast is the bizarre tale of the death and replacement of musician Avril Lavigne.
Of all the conspiracy theories I've heard, the Avril Lavigne one seems like one that people just kind of believe for fun.
The theory is that Avril Lavigne has been dead since 2003, and another person has been posing as her and releasing music in her name.
I don't know.
It first emerged in 2011 in a blog post in Brazil.
What makes this one particularly absurd is the person that had the blog post that suggested it later came out and said, I had no reason for thinking this. I actually just wanted to expose conspiracy theories, make it explicit how easy it is to spread a conspiracy theory.
It may never have made it past one blog post, except an American journalist later shared it as a joke. From there, it went viral and has never truly disappeared. These myths of the lives and deaths of some of the world's most famous people perhaps reveal more about the obsessions of fandom and celebrity than they do about any real conspiracy. But conspiracy has been firmly attached to the life and works of one very famous playwright, one that has been perpetuated for hundreds of years.
Those lips which I have kissed, I know not how oft. Where be your jibes now? Your gambols, your songs, your flashes of merriment that were wont to set the table on a roar. Not one now to mock your own grinning. Quite chop fallen. Now get you to my lady's chamber and tell her that her paint an inch thick. For this favor she must come. Make her laugh at that.
William Shakespeare's plays and sonnets are an enduring part of Western culture. Studied, performed, adapted into new mediums, inspiring new works and introducing new words into our lexicon. They remain a cornerstone of the English literary canon. Yet around this influential and innovative figure swirls a mystery that has only deepened in the many years since he first put quill to paper. At first, it was the possibility. Later, it became a conviction that Shakespeare was in fact not the author of his works. It is a theory that relies on tales of alternate authors with secret, high-profile identities so seductive that it counts among its followers some of the great scientific and creative thinkers of the 19th and 20th centuries.
One of the more fascinating things about the myth are the number of kind of famous people and authors and personalities that have decided to come forward as anti-Stratfordians, as believing that Shakespeare did not write the plays. Famous authors Mark Twain, Henry James, Helen Keller, Sigmund Freud, and even prominent Shakespearean actors.
And the mythology persists among some scholars today. It is rumored to have started in 1781, when the biographer James Wilmot attempted to research Shakespeare nearly 200 years after his death. When Wilmot wasn't able to find any evidence around Shakespeare's hometown, or any letters he wrote or books he owned, he concluded that Shakespeare just wasn't a very well-read man. This myth perhaps reveals more about deeply embedded social hierarchies and classism than about Shakespeare himself.
He actually faced a kind of classism during his own career. The first actual reference we have to Shakespeare is in 1592 from a man named Robert Greene, university-educated professional author and dramatist competitor to Shakespeare. And Greene writes in a preface to a book that he's publishing, complaining of the upstart crow that has recently come on the scene, Shakespeare, and references the fact that he's merely an actor. I think that that sense of classism persists to some extent, right? How could Shakespeare, who did not go to college, essentially, write such learned plays?
The alternative was a front for a more educated, aristocratic author. Names like philosopher Sir Francis Bacon, the romantic Edward de Vere, fellow playwright Christopher Marlowe, and even Queen Elizabeth I herself have all been named as candidates. In reality, there are many references among Shakespeare's contemporaries to him as a native of Stratford-upon-Avon and as a great writer.
People assume that Shakespeare was uneducated and therefore he was actually either incredibly brilliant and entirely self-taught or he didn't write his plays. And the fact of the matter is, we have very good reason to believe that he attended grammar school in Stratford-upon-Avon. And the thing about grammar school during this period is it's Latin grammar, that he had a wide grounding in the classics.
The experience of attending grammar school is also reflected in the content of some of his plays.
He definitely utilizes his own education as well as other plays that he had read and all of the other material that was available to him. But I think we tend to misinterpret that as somehow he didn't have the innate ability to write his plays, and I just don't think that's true.
Your hands and mine are quicker for a fray. My legs are longer though. To run away! I am amazed. I know not what to say.
Several years after his death, a group of actors who worked with Shakespeare lovingly compiled his plays into a collection referred to as the First Folio. It contained a foreword by rival writer Ben Jonson. He confirms Shakespeare's origins, referring to him as the Swan of Avon. There is also no documented evidence to support the theory of an alternate author.
We have no scrap of evidence from the period of anyone actually writing something down to suggest that Shakespeare did not write the plays. No note in a diary, no attribution on a title page of a Shakespeare play, no record of a conversation, nothing that anyone wrote down that sort of questioned Shakespeare's authorship.
Yet the authorship question continues to loom over Shakespeare's legacy. But Shakespeare wasn't the only famous storyteller to be the subject of speculation. On an average day, tens of thousands of people flock through the gates of Disneyland. Avid theme park lovers head down Main Street, USA, to seek out the familiar thrills of their favorite attractions, including Walt Disney's cryogenically frozen body.
So Walt Disney was a cartoonist, right? Most famous for creating Mickey Mouse. And he ended up being a filmmaker, a film producer, right? So Disney Films made animated films.
And last but not least is Dopey. He's nice, but sort of silly.
And then later, live action films. That's exploded into a global media empire.
Well, it goes without saying that I'm very happy, very thrilled.
For many years, Walt was also the friendly face of the brand, hosting the popular Wonderful World of Disney TV show. And Disney parks, opened first in the United States and then overseas, redefined the theme park experience.
To all who come to this happy place, welcome. Disneyland is your land. Here age relives fond memories of the past. And here youth may savor the challenge and promise of the future.
So, when Walt Disney died prematurely of cancer in 1966, it was a blow both to the company he built with his brother Roy and to an adoring public. He was only 65 years old and left projects like Disney World in Orlando unfinished. Within weeks, the rumors were starting. In early 1967, a tabloid reporter claimed that he had snuck into the hospital where Disney was treated in his final days and had seen his body frozen in a cryogenic capsule. It was an appealing fiction, seeded in a small piece of truth. In his later years, Disney had seemed preoccupied with future technologies.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Walt Disney World Preview Center.
His plans for the Epcot Park in Disney World Orlando aimed to capture his notions of future living. Disney was also rumored to have become obsessed with cryogenics, or the long-term freezing of a sick person until medicine could treat the condition.
Just prior to Disney's death by a couple of years, Robert Ettinger wrote his book, The Prospect of Immortality, which is an interesting book in that not very many people read it, but a lot of people knew about it and talked about it.
While there is no direct evidence that Disney was studying cryogenics, the idea persists that he was captivated by the possibility. So seductive was this rumor that in the years after the initial tabloid article, the story of Disney's cryogenically frozen body continued to appear in gossip columns in both the United States and abroad. At some point, the story became that Disney's frozen body was stored in a secret chamber under the Pirates of the Caribbean ride.
The tales there be aplenty in this cursed place.
The story about Disney being buried under the Pirates of the Caribbean may well be clever marketing. It's unclear. What is clear is it helps promote the myth, and Disney hasn't done much to dispute the claims. It perpetuates the myth that he's a mysterious figure.
The claims continue, despite there being no evidence to support them.
So in 2021, news circulated that Disney was going to be thawed out. And it raises the question, why is this, such an interesting topic still today? I think part of the answer has to do with the fact that most people don't know that that's a myth. I certainly grew up thinking Disney was frozen.
The fantasy may persist to this day, but the reality of Disney's death is far more humble and human.
Walt Disney died, he had cancer, and essentially his circulatory system collapsed. The story about Disney's body being, frozen in a cryogenic capsule is just demonstrably false. He was cremated, there were several witnesses to this, but the myth spread.
Oftentimes, facts and rational arguments aren't powerful enough to alter belief, especially when the lines between fact and fiction seem blurred.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
On the 20th of July, 1969, more than 500 million people gathered around television sets to watch the first man walk on the moon.
Neil, this is Houston, loud and clear. There you go. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
It was a dream turned into astonishing reality, the culmination of billions of dollars, over a decade of development and experimentation, and the efforts of around 400,000 employees and contractors.
Beautiful, just beautiful.
It is undoubtedly the biggest achievement humanity as a whole has ever actually made. And when we think about it in terms of space and space exploration, there's lots of big things that have changed the way we view the universe. The moon landing was on the top.
Hello, Neil and Buzz. I'm talking to you by telephone from the Oval Room at the White House. For every American, this has to be the proudest day of our lives.
But to some, it all seemed too good to be true. The question was asked, did we have the technical ability not only to send men into space, but successfully bring them back home? Or was it more plausible as part of a massive, well-orchestrated hoax?
You have to understand the context of the time. There was a lot of issues with people seeing what was going on the Hollywood screen and saying, wow, that looks so incredibly realistic. Why can we just fake certain things?
This theory was put forward by Bill Kaysing, a former employee of Rocketdyne, the company responsible for the Saturn V rockets that took humans to the moon. But he had left their employment long before they perfected their rocket. Nonetheless, he believed it was more likely that NASA had used the technical prowess of Hollywood rather than the technical abilities of their engineers. Much of what he proposed still persists 50 years later in the myth of the moon landing hoax.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again.
People always quote, "Why are there no stars in the camera? Why was the flag flying or blowing in the wind? Why wasn't there more craters on the moon?" All sorts of things. And you can say ad nauseum why. Well, the camera wasn't sensitive enough to pick around the background stars. The flag wasn't waving, it was just wrinkled. There's a number of reasons why.
Then there was the light. Shadows seemed to show multiple sources of light rather than just the sun. He was right that there were multiple light sources, but this was due to light coming from the sun, the Earth reflecting off the moon's surface, the lander, and the astronauts' spacesuits. And finally, there was the positioning of the camera. If Neil Armstrong was the first person on the moon, then who filmed him? But the camera was attached to the side of the lunar module. Despite these explanations, Kaysing wasn't satisfied. He looked at the footage and images seeking evidence of a more elaborate set of circumstances. Instead of NASA sending men to the moon, Kaysing believed that they had secretly whisked astronauts away to Nevada, where they filmed the moon landing in a studio and then sent them on to Hawaii in time for the capsule re-entry. By the time Kaysing published these theories, the Apollo missions had already ended 4 years earlier.
I think you started with the initial doubt of, how did they actually do it? And then people had what we call confirmation bias. This is not a unique thing to the moon landing across all conspiracy theories. You search out for the answers you want to search out for, and then I think it spiraled out of control.
It was becoming increasingly easy to believe the myth was the reality.
Resistance to America's war policy has been growing for some time, but it is only recently that the voices of protest have risen to the surface.
Kaysing's theories also emerged at a time when trust in public officials was historically low.
The President of the United States has been hounded by what has been called the worst political scandal in American history.
It came during different scandals, such as the Watergate scandal, and people were watching this play on TV.
The President has nothing to hide.
So there was kind of a fertile ground for these rhetorics to really kind of flourish.
Add into this perfect storm a space race with the Soviet Union, and conspiracy theorists were convinced the landing had been faked.
It really kind of has the cornerstones of a conspiracy theory. It suggests that, a powerful group conspired against the rest of us, and they did something really bad and significant.
In the years since Kaysing first published his pamphlet, the mythology surrounding the idea the moon landing was a hoax has only grown. A popular and persistent theory revolves around the idea that Stanley Kubrick directed the faked moon landing.
Only a year before, in 1968, Stanley Kubrick made a film called 2001: A Space Odyssey. And in that film, you see some amazing visual effects that depict human beings in space. And so, of course, it led to people thinking, then why can we just fake man being on the moon?
Okay, I'm on the top step. It's a very simple matter to hop down from one step to the next.
As time stretches on since that fateful night in 1969, conspiracies have become more seductive and more elaborate than ever.
They are blackmailing the United States, having information that proves that the moon landings are fraudulent.
I think today when people reflect on the moon, we haven't been there for decades. You have a generation of people who have not seen humans beyond low Earth orbit. And it seems so hard to imagine, if we're not doing it now, how did they do it 40 or 50 years ago?
But to pull off a fake moon landing would have been enormously labor-intensive. And it is improbable that in the past 50 years, no whistleblowers have presented themselves. President Obama met some of the first men who had journeyed into space.
Very rarely do I have such an extraordinary pleasure as I have today to welcome three iconic figures, three genuine American heroes.
Soon, moon landings will pass out of living memory and into history, ready to be reassessed, reinterpreted, and revisioned.
What is actually the root of the problem? It is people are doubting the role of experts. People are doubting progress.
And as long as the myth of the moon landing hoax is marketable, the media will continue to breathe life into the story.
December 1972, AD. May the spirit of peace in which we came be reflected in the lives of all mankind.
And with fiction, the hallmark of entertainment, facts are often troublesome barriers to a good tale. Popular culture, entertainment, and the all-consuming nature of fame are a feature of our daily lives.
There has been a coarsening of the culture in many ways, and those who influence it must be sensitive to that.
We are part fascinated, part unable to escape it. And from the lives of storytellers, both artistic and scientific, fertile myths may grow.
Listening to that show, that really made a big impression on us.
Story making is how we make sense of the world. The fates of important people and their mysteries absolutely fascinate the popular culture because we can make stories of them.
Beyond our fascination with celebrity, telling stories is at the core of who we are. And at times, myths, with their unfettered plot twists and turns, make the most seductive stories of all.
We will have to sit down and think very carefully about future broadcasts.